All right, joining us now with reaction, the author of the New York Times bestseller Treason, former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. Let me ask you, Mr. Speaker, the same question I'm asking John Roberts. The comments by Vice President Pence, the era of strategic patience is over. General McMaster saying it's clear the president's determined not to allow this kind of capability to threaten the United States. All right, so we know they have nuclear weapons. We know they don't have ICBM capability. Now, if you take those words literally, it sounds like they feel that they've got to take out any capability they have. How do you interpret it?
Well, I think that's right, because you can have a nuclear weapon delivered by ship. You could do a variety of different things.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be an ICBM. Doesn't have to fit on a missile. You could put it in a cargo container. So I think this is a serious problem. It's also a grave danger of the North Koreans selling nuclear weapons to terrorists. And I think that we've been through a long stretch here. We had a big fight over this when I was Speaker, and you just could not get the Clinton administration to take it seriously. And, of course, Obama took nothing seriously. So we've had a lost period here of almost 30 years, and they've gradually, steadily built up their capability to hurt Seoul, Korea, built up their capability to threaten their neighbors. And I think that it's clear from military leaders that they really do believe that we are very close to crossing a point after which we could lose an American city. And if you're the President of the United States and you're being told by your military leaders that this is so dangerous that you could literally at some point lose the city, I think you have to take very serious steps to stop that from happening.
Mr. Speaker, let's look at the President's options here for a minute. You're really talking about the possibility that we are going to now engage in a military conflict with North Korea, which we're told Kim Jong-un is mentally unstable. If you look at the neighbors, if he launches a nuclear weapon or conventional weapons for that matter, you're talking about the potential that millions could die in South Korea, millions could die in Japan, and, you know, are we prepared to see that through? Because if we're not, we better not start it.
And millions could, look, and millions could die in China. I mean, they're right
True.
on the border. And so I think that in the very near future, one of three things will happen. I think either he will back down and agree to some kind of suspension of his various programs under enormous pressure from the Chinese, or there will be a military coup and he will be replaced by a more rational leader, or we will begin to take military actions, which could start with things as simple as killing any missile that will be capable of carrying a nuclear weapon. It could be steps that are short of starting an all-out war. And the question then is, what does he do? To what degree, and we don't know the answer, to what degree does he want to survive? To what degree does he think that if he's not tough, that he won't survive in his own society because they'll kill him?
Well, look at his recent behavior. He's killed a brother, he's killed an uncle, he's killed, you know, other detractors.
He called a girlfriend, look, yeah. He killed his girlfriend and her entire band. I mean, this is a guy who
he's unhinged.
Is not nice. Yeah. And I think it makes it in the immediate future very dangerous.
Look, I think what we've got to consider here is, if America is going to take this action, we better be prepared for him, if he's as mentally unstable as reports have said, that he would go scorched earth. That's a possibility. Now, what do you make of, like, for example, the president did have great meetings with the president of China, and he had planned and campaigned on calling them a currency manipulator, but it seems as a result of those bilateral talks that the president was able to get concessions. Number one, you see troops on the border now that China has sent to North Korea. Number two, they sent coal back to North Korea and imported American coal. Three, we see that they're open to trade concessions to the United States. So it seems like there is a possibility of an emerging new alliance, America and China against North Korea. How much time should we allow for that to play out?
Well, I think it's a matter of weeks or months, it's not a matter of years. But they are taking active measures, and that's a good thing. They've publicly said to the North Koreans, don't test another nuclear weapon. That's a good thing.
And they said that they might take out the sites themselves.
Impressed. Right. And as you remember, They were in the middle of dinner at Mar-a-Lago when the president excused himself, went out and held a press event to tell the world that we had just hit Syria with 59 missiles, and then went back in and rejoined the Chinese president. So they do have some notion that he is a very serious guy. And with the bomb they used in Afghanistan, they're also, in a sense, sending a signal. We actually have one bomb a little bit bigger than that. And they're sending a signal that you could see conventional weapons used to take out most of his nuclear sites without ourselves using a nuclear weapon. So I think there are a lot of signals being sent. I find it very worrisome. My father fought there in 1953, went back later in the Army and served in the late 60s. South Korea has come so far. It's so dramatically stronger, better, more prosperous, freer. You'd hate to see anything happen that would disrupt that development. So I think this is a very serious time.
You're the historian. The last century alone, and you look at, Russia, Stalin, fascism, Nazism, Imperial Japan, the killing fields, over 100 million souls died. More recently, to shake people's memories, 9/11 happened. There is evil in the world, and certainly Kim Jong-un seems to.
All right, elsewhere, we have the whole taxa thing, but there is another drama later on today at the White House where all 100 U.S. senators are going to be gathering for a classified briefing on North Korea. This is slated for 3 p.m. Eastern Time, about 2 hours and 15 minutes from now. So what to make of that with Ambassador John Bolton, our former representative to the United Nations. First of all, 100 of them, that's a lot of guys that you hope will show some discretion, but it lessens with each additional senator, doesn't it?
Well, I think there is absolutely no hope of anything that's said in this briefing being kept confidential, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, Trump takes office after 8 years of Obama engaging in what he euphemistically called strategic patience, which is a long period of silence, essentially. And now suddenly people say, well, why do we have a crisis with North Korea? And the answer is because during the Obama administration's 8 years of strategic patience, the North Koreans were developing a nuclear weapons capability, developing their ballistic missile capabilities to the point where across the political spectrum, analysts believe that the North will be able to hit targets in the United States in very short order. Some say next year.
All right. Obviously, when the president wants to meet with all of them, and not just committee heads or leaders of both parties, he wants to share something, right?
Well, I think it's to overcome 8 years of silence and inertia to say this is very serious. This is not a wag the dog scenario. You need to know just how serious this is. And I would add, if North Korea is that close to the capability, let's not forget that Iran could have that capability the next day through a wire transfer. So this threat of nuclear proliferation is very real. And the progress that North Korea has made, I use that word advisedly, people need to be aware of. And if the 100 senators immediately go out and tell all their constituents, good.
What do you think is going to happen there, and what is a provocative act? I'm kind of confused on it, Ambassador, because I'm told that if we were to try to shoot down a missile over North Korea, if they launch yet another one, that is on their territory and could be deemed a hostile act that would get a response. Others say if it's over the open seas, that it's another guess. What is the rule of thumb on this stuff? I don't even know.
I don't think it makes any difference, because I think any American president confronted with the potential of a ballistic missile with God knows what under its nose cone that could hit the United States would take action to destroy that missile as early as possible, up to and including on its launch pad. Look, if Obama had not gutted the Bush National Missile Defense Program, we'd have more confidence. Ironically, by Obama ditching national missile defense, he's made the possibility of a preemptive military strike more likely, because you don't want to decide whether or not, or guess whether Kim Jong-un got out of bed on the right side or the wrong side on any given morning. Obviously, nobody wants military force used if we can avoid it, but that really means China has to step up, which they have not done for 25 years, and see that North Korea is a pretty ugly piece of baggage for them as well as for the rest of the world, and do what's necessary to make sure we don't have to face that decision on preemptive military force.
Do you think China is doing everything it can to mitigate this?
No, I don't at this point. I think it's too early to tell whether the presidents really changed their mind. Look, I've watched them for 25 years go humma, humma, humma. Yeah, we don't want North Korea to have a nuclear weapon, but they have not applied the force or the persuasion that they alone have the capability of doing. I think really we've got to aim higher than just stopping the North Korean nuclear program. I think we've got to reunite the two Koreas. When you say to Kim Jong-un, give up your nuclear program, what Kim Jong-un hears is give up your government and maybe give up your life. The nuclear capability and the North Korean regime are one and the same thing to him and his generals, and therefore the only way to be safe and avoid potential catastrophe on the Korean Peninsula is to move to a controlled reunification. Kim Jong-un won't like that either, but that's too bad.
Yeah, well, that's the way he stayed in power. That's the way his father stayed in power, and his father's father stayed in power. So there's something in what you say. Ambassador, thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil.
It's not every day that the entire Senate is asked to attend a briefing on matters of national security, which underscores the urgency by which the Trump administration is treating the threat posed by Pyongyang's continued, saber-rattling and threats of more nuclear tests. That briefing taking place at the White House tomorrow. All this as the USS Michigan, which can carry up to 154 Tomahawk missiles, pulling into a South Korean port as we got word of North Korea's conducting live fire drills. The submarine will soon join the USS Carl Vinson aircraft carrier strike group for exercises in the Sea of Japan. Senator Lindsey Graham will be one of the lawmakers at tomorrow's briefing. He believes the U.S. must be prepared to launch a preemptive strike against the community north as the last resort. He met with the President Trump last night and had this to say this morning on America's Newsroom. Watch.
I had dinner with the President last night. It was a great dinner. I really am impressed with his commander-in-chief skills here. He is not going to let this nut job in North Korea develop a missile with a nuclear weapon on top to hit America. He doesn't want a war any more than I do, but he's not going to let them get a missile. That's where they're headed, and China needs to up their game to stop this before it's too late.
Ambassador, there's really no better expert than you on the couch today. Can you just react to what Lindsey Graham just said?
Well, I think he's exactly right. And I think one of the reasons it's so important that President Trump is having all the 100 senators to the White House is after 8 years of Barack Obama not talking about the threat of North Korea, I think it's important that the president have his top military and intelligence advisors lay out what they know about North Korea's capabilities. Because if military action has to be taken, everybody ought to know just how serious this threat is. And I would underline, it's not simply what North Korea can do or what we expect they will be able to do in a very short time, which is miniaturize a nuclear weapon, put it on the top of an ICBM, and hit targets in the United States. Whatever North Korea can do, Iran, because of its close relationship with North Korea, can do the next day through a wire transfer. So we could talk a lot at some point about the Iran nuclear deal. The problem right now, the tip of the spear, is North Korea and its capabilities, but they can be shared with anybody, which is why this is such a serious moment.
You know, the second question I have for you is it seems like things have escalated in the first 80 days of Trump's presidency. And is it surprising to you that this era of patience, as our vice president said, has come to an end? And why now? Why are things escalating the way they are right now?
Well, I think again, the administration is exactly correct to reject what the Obama administration called strategic patience with North Korea, which is a synonym for doing nothing. Indeed, at the end of the Obama administration, there's widespread consensus that North Korea was very close to getting the ability to hit the United States. Our commander of U.S. Forces Korea said as much last year. Just a couple weeks ago, the commander of the Strategic Command said the only thing he doubted North Korea had the capability to do right now was the actual miniaturization. So they are very close. And this long period, it's not just Obama's 8 years, it's 25 years of a misguided notion that we could talk North Korea out of its nuclear weapons. The chickens are coming home to roost. And the threat to the United States is real. And it's, as these things go, imminent.
Ambassador, the White House has recently said that they are confident that China is making progress in aiding them and putting pressure on North Korea. They're confident that they're going to come along. How do you see China's role in all of this at this point?
Well, I'm not confident, I have to say. I've watched China over a long period of time do a two-step on this, saying, yes, we don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons, but not exerting the pressure that they uniquely can bring to bear against North Korea. So they're going through the motions right now. I think maybe they're convinced that President Trump has been very clear to Xi Jinping that either they solve the problem or we will solve it, and if there were military action on the Korean Peninsula, it would have direct ramifications for China. But based on 25 years of performance to date, I think I'll keep my powder dry for a while on judging Chinese performance.
Yeah. Ambassador, I have a question for you. I know militarily there's a saying that says if you can't be respected, then at least be feared. So we're in the situation where we have a new president, and we know, I was talking to Texas Senator Brian Birdwell the other day. We were talking about the Iran hostage situation and how Carter was thinking about it much like Obama did, right? He was thinking about how do I get these hostages released, but he didn't do anything. And then the day Reagan comes into office, after 444 days of those prisoners being held, they release them, because they know Reagan is willing to do something that Carter wasn't. So sometimes I think that North Korea is saying President Trump is willing to do something that Obama wasn't. And so I feel like this is a little bit of posturing and putting their toe in the water to see what he's willing to do, more than it is an actual threat. But I want to know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I don't think we're going to see hostilities because of the live fire exercise or anything like that. I think it's the real risk to us of the deliverable nuclear weapons capability. But I tell you, as has been remarked, there's nothing better than the scenario of Chinese President Xi Jinping having dinner with President Trump at Mar-a-Lago when the president drops over coffee and dessert that he's just launched 5 dozen Tomahawk missiles at Syria. Let Xi Jinping absorb that for a while.
Right.
And he told them, at least I've heard, at that dinner, the point that either China solved the North Korean nuclear problem or we would. So I think the lesson has been learned. I just have my doubts about China's assessment of the situation and whether they really are going to do anything. I've long believed the only real solution here is a new alignment on the peninsula, merging the two countries as was originally intended after World War II, because until you get rid of this regime entirely, the erratic, dangerous nature of the regime poses a threat to us and all our friends in the region.
Right. And what's in it for North Korea if they were to throw a nuke our way? That's what I'm baffled by, too.
Well, I think this regime has a Hitler in the bunker mentality. I don't think it's rational in our terms. But I also think it's why, for the past 25 years, we've failed to get the North to give up the weapon. Because when we say to North Korea, give up your nuclear weapons, what they hear is give up your regime.
Right.
They see the two as synonymous. That's why it's only with China's direct involvement, which over the years they've tried to say to the United States, look, you have a problem with North Korea. Wrong. China's got the problem with North Korea. We all do, and we've got to solve it together, or we won't solve it except by military force, which, as Lindsay said, is the last.
Well, we welcome Ambassador John Bolton. Good to see you, Ambassador.
Glad to be with you.
How do we stop North Korea?
Well, I think ultimately the only real solution is to reunite the two Koreas, to persuade China that it's in their best interest that this reunification occur. We've seen too many examples over the past 25 years where China's played a double game, where they've said, yes, we agree, we don't want North Korea to have a nuclear weapon, but they haven't really put on the pressure that they could. Maybe this time will be different. I know the White House is optimistic, and I hope they're right, but I don't know that we've seen the evidence of it yet.
Ambassador, how do we stop a North Korean missile strike? Because Fox News' Brit Hume, he says communist North Korea may be able to attack the U.S. Let's listen.
As it appears that North Korea is now closer than ever to putting together a nuclear weapon that they would have the ability to deliver even to the west coast of the United States. It seems to me they have been very shrewd indeed at scaring the daylights out of our allies in the region and the world community, as it's sometimes called, and have thereby been able to pursue their nuclear ambitions apace while extracting concession after concession in deal after deal with the West, in which they basically come out ahead.
I mean, okay, so we know China routinely fails to enforce sanctions. You know, banks and companies continue to trade and do deals with North Korea. So how do we stop a military strike, a missile strike from North Korea?
Well, if it got to that point, and I think they are getting increasingly close to it, the president would have to consider preemptive military action, because any president's first responsibility is to protect the people of the United States. That could well lead to war on the peninsula, catastrophic collapse of the North Korean government, a lot of innocent civilians in Seoul, South Korea, and elsewhere being killed. That's why, even though time is growing very short, and I mean very short, trying to work out a diplomatic solution with China is important. China has enormous economic leverage on North Korea. It supplies over 90% of North Korea's oil, large amounts of food and other humanitarian supplies. What China's feared, though, is if they apply that pressure, the government will collapse. And the United States will have its troops on the Yalu River. Actually, we don't want our troops on the Yalu River. There's a deal here that if people in China are realistic enough, they will see that it's in their interest. Frankly, we should have started this conversation 10 or 15 years ago. So we're in a race between the diplomacy of reunification, in my view, and a real military threat from North Korea.
We have another topic for you, Iran. More provocations from Iran. A U.S. destroyer in the Persian Gulf forced to alter course by an Iranian vessel acting aggressively. Now, a U.S. official telling Fox that the Iranian ship had its weapons manned and came within.
Joining us now with much more, the former ambassador to the United Nations, Fox News contributor John Bolton. John, I'm going to have my monologue coming up in the next segment. I delayed it, obviously, for the breaking news tonight, but one of the things I am interpreting from this, America is back. If a red line is drawn, there will be action. There's no UN approval needed. This is a very different America the world is seeing tonight than they were seeing, say, 27 hours ago.
Absolutely. The Obama era for American foreign policy is clearly over. I thought this strike ordered by the president was very measured, very precise. Had a very limited rationale because of the use of chemical weapons, but very effective. And I think the message that it sent around the world to adversaries, potential adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, well beyond Syria, something that needed to be heard. And I think it's going to change a lot of calculations. I don't think you can underestimate the reverberations that we're going to see from this.
Listen, I'm certain that Pyongyang, North Korea, I'm certain that Iran, and certainly even Russia got a very different feel for America last night. What do you make of, I mean, in your capacity as a former UN ambassador, here's the President of the United States, he's having dinner with the Premier of China and has to lean over probably during dessert and say, by the way, I probably need to give you a heads up. I just launched 59 Tomahawk missiles at Syria because they killed innocent men, women, and children with chemical weapons. What does that say to China?
Well, it's enormously important because we know that North Korea's nuclear weapons program was right at the top of the agenda in their bilateral meetings. And what Trump basically said is when a country like Syria undertakes solemn commitments in the Chemical Weapons Convention, in the famous John Kerry deal that we thought eliminated, or at least the Obama administration thought eliminated Syria's chemical weapons, when countries violate those commitments, there are going to be consequences. So when Donald Trump raises the North Korean nuclear weapons program today, Xi Jinping knows that unlike the last 8 years, he's talking to somebody who's prepared to take action to protect American national security.
Ambassador, I'm going to play in the next segment comments by President Obama, by Susan Rice, by John Kerry, all saying, oh, Obama's red line in the sand with Syria, well, that caused them to eliminate all of their chemical weapons. They were wrong. They were dead wrong. We saw the impact this past Tuesday, dead children lying in the street and many others suffering and bleeding and dying. Now, my question is this. What if Obama and Kerry and Susan Rice were as wrong on Iran and the deal that they made and their capacity to make nuclear weapons as they were in Syria and Bashar al-Assad getting rid of chemical weapons?
That's exactly the right question. These people live in a fantasy land where rogue states, authoritarian governments make commitments and then live up to them, and we can verify that they did it. In Syria, we saw the consequence of this. All those chemical weapons were taken care of. John Kerry told us, Barack Obama, Susan Rice.
Yeah, they all did.
And they could verify it. They were sure of it, just like they're sure that Iran has stopped its efforts toward deliverable nuclear weapons, just as they could cut a deal with North Korea. This is the kind of lesson, I think, for the new Trump administration. When you sit down across the table with the Russians, with the Iranians, the North Koreans, they may agree with what you want. They may tell you all kinds of interesting things. They don't have the slightest intention of meeting their obligations. That's where the risk to America really comes in.
All right, last question, Ambassador, because we have this very public posture by Russia, and then we saw Russia pull back a little bit earlier this week when they said their support for Syria was not unconditional. Many ways it seems like they're doing a little saber rattling, but behind the scenes, they do not want to take on this issue of Syria and the United States. Didn't they have the capacity to put up their missile defense system last night, and they didn't do it at this very Air Force base?
Well, I think the one thing that comes out of this that's good, and we did give the Russians advance notice, and they did not apparently pass it on to the Syrians. But that's, yes. Well, we had a commitment. But I think the Russians are embarrassed by what Assad did in that chemical attack. They're not concerned with the humanitarian aspect, but they know now they've got a problem. The principal Russian interest here is protecting their naval base at Tartus, their air base at Latakia. You know, I think they'll stick with Assad as long as they can, and they would only replace him with somebody who would allow them to stay there. That's what their interests are, and that's what they'll maintain.
All right, Ambassador, a very different America than 27 hours ago. Thank you for being with us. Appreciate it.
Sean.
Now is Ambassador John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and Fox News contributor. Ambassador Bolton, first of all, I know you don't have any insight on this, but perhaps just your thoughts. Could it have been possible that we were part of the reason why that missile launch failed in North Korea?
Well, it's possible. I mean, I don't think the North Korean missile test apparatus is linked into the World Wide Web. If there was an effort at cyber sabotage, it would have come from something that we've got, or the South Koreans have inside North Korea. Rockets can fail on their own, too. Who knows at this point?
Well, the key is, and the thing that I think most people were concerned about over the weekend was whether or not they'd have another nuclear test. They didn't. That might or might not have been because of pressure from China. But if they do over the next couple of days, how should we respond?
Well, look, we have it from the commander of U.S. Forces South Korea, from the commander of the Strategic Command, from all kinds of sources, that North Korea is very close to the point where they can miniaturize a nuclear device, put it on an intercontinental ballistic missile, and hit targets in the United States. That is the point of danger for us that 8 years of watching Obama do nothing have brought us to. So that's why this is so serious now. That's why each new test, ballistic missile or nuclear, is so serious, and why the pressure that President Trump's applying to China is also so significant.
And that's why you're hearing such a different tone from a U.S. administration about North Korea. It's not that we've been chummy with them over the years, but we've been much nicer to them, if you will, than what Vice President Pence is now saying in South Korea. Let's just play a little soundbite of that and get your impression.
Over the past 18 months, North Korea has conducted 2 unlawful nuclear tests and an unprecedented number of ballistic missile tests, even conducting a failed missile launch as I traveled here for this visit. The era of strategic patience is over.
Now, Ambassador, that era of strategic patience, a fancy phrase that he uses, that goes back not only through Obama, but one could say all through a Republican administration and before that to the Clinton era, right?
Yeah, look, the United States has tried for 25-plus years diplomatically to talk North Korea out of its nuclear weapons program. We've tried coercion through economic sanctions. It's all failed. And it's all failed because North Korea is never voluntarily going to give up its nuclear weapons program. It is their ace in the hole. It is their insurance policy. So I think as time has gone on, their nuclear devices have gotten more sophisticated. Their ballistic missiles have a longer range and better guidance systems. The threat gets more and more acute, and that's why we are today in a very, very tough situation with few good options.
Well, meanwhile, a little closer to home, Turkey's president narrowly winning a controversial referendum over the weekend that will greatly expand his power. Now, Ambassador, Erdogan, the prime minister of Turkey, has been a lot too chummy for my wishes with the radical extremists. Some people even suggested he was friendly to
Well, tensions remain high tonight with North Korea, which tried and failed to launch a ballistic missile last weekend. There's been a lot of speculation over whether they can strike the United States, the mainland U.S., with a nuclear weapon. But even if they can't, what would war with the Kim's fortress state look like? One man who has thought a lot about this is George Friedman. He's founder of Geopolitical Futures, and he joins us now. George, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So what are our options? The White House has said we're not going to put up with any more nuclear testing, ballistic missile testing. North Korea said we're going to continue doing both. Where do we go from here?
So we have to think about taking out the nuclear facilities they have. Now, does intelligence know where they are? Do they know how well constructed they are, whether they can be penetrated? I suspect they do. But the big problem is this: a huge concentration of artillery on the DMZ in the northeast area that has Seoul in range. Seoul is the capital of South Korea. It is a city of 10 million people. And if they open fire on that city, there's going to be a Holocaust. Therefore, it's not enough to bomb nuclear facilities.
Right.
We have to take out the artillery. And that's not going to be an easy job. That's not going to be a one-day strike. It's so much scattered around that it's going to be strategic bombers attacking day after day to take those out. And in the meantime, they'll be firing at Seoul.
Oh, for sure. And they spent 65 years putting this stuff in place with an attack like that in mind. So that seems tough. So meanwhile, as these tensions rise, China, which plays an integral role in the Korean Peninsula on both, are they using this to their advantage, these tensions?
For a very long time, I've seen them facing demands from the United States, from all administrations, for shifts in their trade policy, for shifts in currency. What has constantly happened is that sometime in that negotiations, the North Koreans do something insane. We feel we have to respond. We immediately run to the Chinese and say, Chinese, help us out. They do. The North Koreans calm down. We go back to negotiation. They said, hey, guys, we just helped you out. I mean, now you're going to push us in trade?
Right.
The interesting thing about Donald Trump is he admitted that this is the game. This is a game that's been being played for many years. But he said, I'll trade for North Korea.
Huh. So by admitting and telling the rest of the world that the Chinese are, in fact, playing a game designed to increase their trade advantage, was that helpful to us?
Well, it has this much help. It takes the obvious and makes it believable. This has been going on for a long time. It's been going on in the Obama administration. It went on the Bush administration. Now the president has simply said, this is the game that the Chinese are playing.
Right.
It sets up his future move, however. He says, we've been blackmailed the last time on North Korea. Let's get back to trade. But he's made it clear that if they help this time, he's going to cut a better deal. I've never seen a politician do this. In the open, simply admit what the game is.
Interesting. I mean, there's got to be an advantage over the way it's been played previously. So would you rate North Korea the greatest nuclear threat to the United States, or is there a scarier one?
At this moment, it's the greatest one. It's the greatest one because we're not certain. We know that it has the ability to build nuclear weapons. Can it miniaturize them? Can it make them rugged enough to be launched off by a missile? Are the missiles reliable enough? That doesn't seem to be the case. But I can say that easily because I have no responsibility.
Right.
The president has to make the call. How much of a chance is he willing to take and figure out just what the price is going to be? This is the most dangerous one, I suspect, because it's going to be the hardest one to eliminate.
Do you think, finally, that the North Korean government is predictable and rational in its evil way?
It has been perfectly predictable. It wants to appear to be weak so that nobody bothers it, crazy so nobody pokes at it because who knows what they'll do,
yes,
and ferocious, capable of destroying the world.
Right.
And even though they are a country that is insignificant by most measures, they have managed to maneuver the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Americans into treating them as an equal. And that is a brilliant move, and they have done that over the years, and you don't have to like them to respect them. They are good at this.
Yeah. No, it's a prison move. Someone hassles you, you bite his nose off, they never bother you again. Have you seen that before? George, thank you for joining us. That was really interesting.
Thanks for having me.
Please join me in welcoming back to North Carolina, Ambassador John Bolton.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jim, for the kind introduction, a little walk down memory lane. But the hearing that his committee had yesterday, it's an annual affair with the heads of some of the key agencies in the U.S. intelligence community. Because the picture that they painted, as he said, was a grim picture, that things are not getting better. And there's one reason that the trajectory continues to point downhill, and that's 8 years of failed policies under Barack Obama. The Trump administration has inherited a series of problems around the world that actually are interconnected in many respects. And it goes to the fundamental task of an American administration and really the debate we have as American citizens about what the proper place in the world America should hold. And it's a complex issue. It involves a lot of considerations. Many people in the political world say Americans really don't care that much about foreign policy. Their votes and their interests are driven by domestic considerations. I actually think that's not right. I think there's a deep instinct in the American people who appreciate what to me is the fundamental fact, which is that you cannot have a continuation of a vibrant American economy and our very way of life here at home unless you have a strong American position internationally. And the converse is true, too. As Senator Burr said, you can't sustain a strong American position internationally without a strong economy and prospects for growth domestically. So the two really are tied very closely together, as Art Pope said earlier tonight. And I think this is really, we're having this debate in the United States today. And I think it's important for all of us as citizens to understand why this strong American presence is required. You know, we have created as a country since 1945, since the culminating finish to World War II, we have created an international order that sustains what we do here at home. Now, we didn't create it with a clear strategic vision in mind. Some pieces of it we put together because we understood the nature of the threat we faced, for example, from Soviet Russia and its communist aspirations. We built NATO. We built a series of bilateral alliances around the world. Other things we did, perhaps with less planning, less understanding of what we were putting together. In a way, you could say we built this really minimal international order, as they said about the acquisition of the British Empire. It was acquired in a fit of absence in mind. We didn't fully understand what we were doing, but each of these pieces fits together and helps ensure whatever level of international stability and security there is around the world. That is what has allowed the enormous growth of international trade, investment, financial movement, personal movement, communications in this 70-plus years since the end of World War II. Now, we did it through a system of alliances. We did it in a lot of very complex ways, and there's a strong feeling among many people in this country that a lot of other people benefit from what we did and don't pay their fair share of the burden. And to a certain extent, that's true. There's no doubt about it. I've been in more discussions than I can tell you with over time, and I bet Jim and Aldana have as well, about getting our NATO allies to pay their fair share of the alliance. We're seeing a debate in the Trump administration about that right now. And I don't dispute that a lot of our good friends are kind of free riders in many respects. But let's be very clear. We built this minimal international order for ourselves. Others benefit, but we didn't build it for them. We didn't do it out of altruism. We did it out of basic self-interest. And the reason for that is, if we didn't do it, nobody else was going to do it for us. The United Nations wasn't going to do it for us. As That's one thing Jesse Helms understood better than almost any American politician during his time in office. But none of our friends were going to do it either. European Union can't do it. We do it. We do it for ourselves, we do it for others, but fundamentally, we are responsible. It's not, I called it a moment ago, an international order. It's really an American international order. And if we step back from it, if we say, well, it's just too difficult to sustain, one of two things is going to happen. Either it will begin to disintegrate with palpably negative consequences for the United States down the road, or somebody else will decide they'll take on the burden. Russia or China or somebody who will not have our best interest at heart. You can bet on that. So when we feel burdened by these responsibilities, or we feel tired, or I feel it all the time for America, we don't feel adequately appreciated, you just have to grit your teeth and remember that the consequences of laying the burden down will be felt by our children and grandchildren. It's not every nation that's called to this kind of responsibility, and I think in the contemporary world, the reason why it's the United States is very clear. There is no other country like ours, and never has been. And this has been recognized by a long time. You know, we talk about American exceptionalism, and some people think that that's off-putting to other peoples in the world. We didn't make up that designation. The first person to refer to American exceptionalism was Alexis de Tocqueville. As Senator Burr quoted him, I'll give you another quote from de Tocqueville. He said, "It may truly be said that the Americans are exceptional, and that no other democratic people will ever have the same place." Because he understood what was different about America from France and the other countries in Europe. And it's that uniqueness that's propelled us to the circumstances that we have today. And that's why appreciating the threats that we face internationally and developing strategies to deal with them are so important, because if we're not doing it, we're going to face one challenge after another and not be in a position to respond to it adequately. And I just want to cover a couple tonight, especially because some of them have gotten attention in the media, and we've seen a number of very strange things happening in our political circumstances. Let me just start with Russia, where suddenly the Democratic Party, after approximately 40 years of not understanding the potential threat that we face in the Kremlin, has awakened to it. And thank God they're now diligent in worrying about what's going to happen. We could have used this several decades ago. Better late than never, I suppose, is the best thing you can say. But the fact is that we do see in the Middle East, in Eastern and Central Europe, under Vladimir Putin's leadership, that Russia is trying to assert itself. Putin foreshadowed this in 2006 in his last formal address in that term as president of Russia, when he said the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Now, most of us, I bet Jesse Helms leading the pack, would have said, I thought it was a pretty good way to end the 20th century. But what Putin was foreshadowing was he intended, one way or another, to reestablish Russian influence, Russian hegemony in the space of the former Soviet Union and elsewhere. And what you see today is that Russia has violated the rule that we laid down in 1945, that never again would military force be used on the continent of Europe to change international boundaries. He's done it. He's tried to do it in Georgia. He's done it for sure in Ukraine. He's looking at places to do it elsewhere. The West response has not been adequate, and it's still not adequate today. Putin has reasserted Russian influence in the Middle East to a level and an extent that we haven't seen since the 1970s, when Anwar Sadat threw the Soviet advisors out, brought Egypt into the Western orbit and was able to agree to the Camp David peace agreement with Israel that to this day is the foundation stone of American policy in the Middle East on a bipartisan basis. The Russians have built a new air base at Latakia in Syria, minutes flying time from Israel's northern border, to go with their naval base at Tartus. They're the ones dictating the course of events there, dealing with ISIS, but strengthening the hand of the Iranian coalition, Iran, the Baghdad regime, which is unfortunately dominated by Iran, the Assad regime in Syria, the Hezbollah terrorists in Lebanon. Russia's on the move, and it has not seen an adequate response from the West. It is unquestionably the case, and I think you'll see from the congressional investigations, that the Russians tried to interfere in our elections last year, tried to destabilize, tried to break faith that Americans have in their political institutions. We'll see to what extent they understood whose candidacy they were supporting. It's not to say that anybody in this country was aiding them one way or the other, but we see evidence of Russian interference in elections all over the continent of Europe this year and looking into next year. This is the kind of effort harkens back to Cold War days, but it's very serious. Everybody in this room knows how intense partisan feelings are in this country and how divided we have become on so many issues. If Russia or anyone else can degrade our faith in our basic institutions, they've undermined our capacity for self-government, which is why this threat is so real and why it needs a strong response. And you know, nobody is watching what is happening with the Russians in the Middle East and Europe and the United States more closely than China, because they see that if the United States, the leader of the NATO alliance, the greatest geopolitical alliance in international affairs, I think, in human history, if we can't make that alliance work in the North Atlantic area, it's going to be much more difficult to resist the Chinese in East and Southern Asia. And make no mistake, they are on the move too. They've dramatically increased their defense budget and continue to do so. They've acquired weapons capabilities that bring them into a position, certainly in their region, to challenge American power, especially as our military capabilities were degraded over the last 8 years. They are determined to make the South China Sea a province of China. You say, well, big deal, what's the South China Sea to us? Just bear in mind, every barrel of oil that goes from the Middle East to our key trading partners, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, goes through the South China Sea. Roughly half of the seaborne commerce of the world goes through the South China Sea. If the Chinese can change it from international waters to a Chinese lake, they've got their hands around the throats of critical economies in East and South Asia. And they, like the Russians, have been perfecting the art of cyber warfare. We know that already between China and Russia, they've penetrated virtually all of the top 500 American corporations. Much of the federal government has been hacked either by Russia or China. Our own estimates are that most personnel records in the Office of Personnel Management in Washington are now in Beijing, where they've copied them and taken them. So I'm just delighted that the Chinese have every FBI investigation that I've ever been subjected to, and the FBI files for everybody else who ever wanted a job in the federal government. That's just wonderful to know. And our response has been inadequate. So we've got, in the form of Russia and China, although they certainly have their respective weaknesses, strategic challenges to the United States that we simply cannot allow to go unanswered. We've also got far more immediate challenges. The threat of nuclear proliferation and the proliferation of chemical and biological weapons, and the continuing threat of international terrorism. Look around at the terrorist attacks we've seen in Europe, in the United States. Even though ISIS may be under enormous pressure now in the caliphate it is declared in Iraq and Syria, the fact is that all across the broader Middle East, beginning at the Atlantic edge of Africa and sweeping all the way over to India. State structures that have existed for many, many years, some of them going back to the Versailles Treaty after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was broken up. These state structures are crumbling. Governments have dissolved and anarchy rules in country after country. The government of Libya barely functions, and Libya has become a host to terrorist groups and warlords as the country is broken apart. Boko Haram continues to rampage across Nigeria and Cameroon along the seam between Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa. Somalia hasn't had an effective government in 25 years. The Sudan has descended again into civil war. Yemen has completely failed as a functioning state. The Egyptians have lost control at night of the Sinai Peninsula. Iraq and Syria, obviously a host for ISIS, have broken apart. And this disintegration of these structures gives the opportunity for terrorist groups, human traffickers, narcotics traffickers to take root and threaten Western Europe and the United States. And trying to put that back together is not going to be easy. One reason that it's happened has been the withdrawal of American interest from the region over these past years. It has endangered our friends like Israel and the Arab states, the oil-producing monarchies of the Arabian Peninsula. So terrorism remains something that we have to focus on. It's not caused by poverty. It's an ideology. I think the president's exactly right to say you've got to call it what it is. It is radical Islamic terrorism. This is not a knock on a religion or an ethnic group. King Abdullah of Jordan has called this struggle a civil war within Islam. I think he's exactly right, and if it's good enough for the Muslim king of a Muslim country, it ought to be good enough for us to be able to understand, because it's actually been Muslims over these past several years who have borne the brunt of the tragedy from the terrorist. But if we ignore the problem, the threat will only continue to grow. And when you look as well at the possibility of the perfect storm of terrorists getting hold of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, imagine what 9/11 would be using these weapons of mass destruction instead of the method that they did use, which is why the threat from Iran and North Korea is something that isn't distant anymore. You know, the Iran nuclear deal that Obama signed, I've compared to an American diplomatic Waterloo. It is the single worst international agreement, the most dangerous thing I think we've done in our entire history. It gives people the false sense of security that the Iranian nuclear weapons program is under control. It most certainly is not. And the idea that Iran ever had any intention to comply with it, I think, has been belied, despite the State Department's recent certification of Iran's compliance in multiple respects over the past now almost 2 years since it was signed. When you look as well at Iran's role as the world's central banker for international terrorism for the past 37 years, add to that the nuclear threat that they are working toward, you can see why the Middle East faces an existential threat that will have an enormous impact on the United States. North Korea, which has worked closely with Iran on its ballistic missile program for 30 years, and quite likely has on the nuclear side as well, is estimated by our military commanders in South Korea to be very close to being able to mate a miniaturized nuclear device to a ballistic missile and hit targets in this country. Some estimate that capability to be next year. The North Korean regime is not rational in the sense that we are, maybe rational in its own terms, but its mentality is more like Hitler in the bunker. It's extraordinarily dangerous. We do not yet have a strategic response to it. The Obama policy was called strategic patience. That's roughly translated as a synonym for doing nothing, which is what we did for 8 years while they continued to advance their capabilities. And the closeness between Iran and North Korea means that whatever Iran's doing on the nuclear deal, the day North Korea gets a deliverable nuclear weapon, Iran can have it the next day by wire transfer. So this threat of nuclear weapons, whether delivered by ballistic missiles or being given to terrorists and smuggled across our southern border, or being put on a ship and sailed into any harbor that a tramp steamer can sail into, is real. It's palpable. This is what we need to be talking about to understand the nature of the threat and to develop strategies to defeat it. I think the single most important thing that President Trump has done since he took office, although it hasn't gotten a lot of attention, is reverse 8 years of decline in our military budget, to increase it, to try and build back the capabilities we need. My only criticism would be the increase has not been big enough. I understand why we want to cut our annual deficits and reduce the national debt. I'd simply recommend cutting more wasteful domestic spending. You know, you could imagine cutting domestic spending all the way back to the pathetically low levels of, let's say, 2008. Remember that? And you'd still have adequate room for increases in the military budget. But if we don't build that capability back, we will be unable to reestablish the structures of deterrence that are so critical to avoid the challenges in the first place. We're not eager to use military force. We want to see it used as a last resort. And the way you do that is by building positions of strength that cause your adversaries to say, we're not even going to think about challenging the United States. That's what Ronald Reagan and others meant when they talked about peace through strength. And yet our policy these past 8 years has been that it's America that's the problem, that we're so assertive, so pushy, so successful, that other countries turn to terrorism and nuclear weapons in response. And so the theory was if we could only convince Iran and North Korea that we don't have hostile intent, they'll begin to behave like civilized nations. Well, we've tried that and it hasn't worked. And it's not going to work, and we're running out of time. Nobody wants to find out what the end result of the development of these kinds of capabilities is. Nobody wants to see a return to a world like the Cold War, where we were at sword's point with the Soviet Union, to see the same return with Russia or China. We have an opportunity in the next 4 years to reestablish these positions of strength, these structures of deterrence. And if we fail to do it now, the consequences, I think, will come thick and fast. And this is why, as citizens, I'm actually optimistic. I know the picture I've painted isn't the most encouraging. I like to say I spread sweetness and light wherever I go. But the fact is, you have to know what the threats are that you face so that you can take adequate steps to protect against them. And we have it in our power to do it. And that's why, to me, the work of the Jesse Helms Center is so important, because Helms understood this every minute he breathed. And his interests were very wide-ranging, but he knew more than anything else that if the United States is not safe, then freedom is not safe in the world, and it's not safe here at home. So in his memory, I say we've all got to get back to work and make sure that we don't forget the lessons that Jesse Helms taught us. Thank you very much.